The deed hit the table between them like a gunshot. Willa Kestner stared at the folded document, at the sharp black lettering of her family's land description, at the red wax seal that meant it was official and real and done. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs beneath the edge of the table, so the man across from her would not see. Leland Kade did not look like a man who had just handed back the only thing she had left in the world. He looked like a man waiting for a storm he had already decided to walk straight into. His jaw was set like iron, his dark eyes level and unreadable under the brim of a hat he had not removed when he came through the door of the land office. There was a cut above his left brow she did not know the origin of, dust on his coat from what had clearly been a hard ride. He looked like he had not slept. "It was always yours," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel scraped against wood. "I just made sure it stayed that way." For a single, suspended second, Willa could not speak. The land office around them was small and hot and smelled of ink and cedar. And outside, through the single dirty window, she could see the main street of Harlan Creek, Texas, going about its business in the flat October heat of 1882, without any awareness that her entire world had just been rearranged. She had come here this morning expecting to be told she had 30 days to vacate. She had come here with her chin up and her grief swallowed down, and every instinct she owned screaming that she had already lost. But then Leland Kade had walked through that door, and the deed was on the table. "You bought it," she said. Her voice came out harder than she intended, cracked at the edges like old leather. "You bought my father's land. You stood in this very room and you outbid Calhoun and you walked out with the deed in your hand. I saw it happen. Half this town saw it happen." She pushed herself up from the chair, needing height, needing something solid beneath her feet. "And now you are sitting there telling me that you did it for me." Leland Kade looked at her steadily. He did not flinch. He did not look away. "Yes," he said. And in that single syllable was something so raw and unguarded that Willa Kestner, who had not allowed herself to cry once in the 6 weeks since she had buried her father, felt the ground shift beneath her. She had known this man for the better part of a year, and she had spent most of it hating him. The story of how they arrived at this moment in the dusty land office on Harlan Creek's Main Street in the autumn of 1882 was not a short one, and it was not a gentle one, and it had very little about it that resembled anything Willa Kestner would have ever chosen for herself. She had not chosen any of it. She had not chosen to lose her mother at 11 to a fever that swept through the valley like fire through dry grass. She had not chosen to watch her father, Thomas Kestner, spend the next 15 years building their small cattle operation on the edge of Comanche Creek into something that should have been enough to carry them both forward. She had not chosen to lose him to a chest illness in the late August heat, 2 months short of her 26th birthday, leaving her the sole inheritor of 430 acres, a modest herd, a weathered house, and a debt she had not known existed. That debt was the thing that had started all of it. She found out about it on the 9th day after her father's burial, when a man named Aldous Finch came to her door. Finch was the business agent for Conrad Calhoun, which meant he was the human face of every deal Calhoun had made in Harlan Creek and the surrounding county for the last decade. He was small and precise and always wore a black vest regardless of the heat, and when he stood on her porch with his hat in his hands and his face arranged into an expression of professional sympathy, Willa had known before he opened his mouth that whatever he was there to say was going to be terrible. It was. Her father had borrowed money from Calhoun's banking operation the previous year, $340, secured against the land. There had been a drought that spring, and the calf numbers were down, and Thomas had made the calculation that a short-term loan would bridge the gap. He had not told Willa because he had not wanted to worry her, and because he had every intention of paying it back before she ever knew, and because Thomas Kestner had been a proud and private man who had believed until his last breath that everything would work itself out if you kept working hard enough. The interest, Finch explained gently, had accrued. Combined with the principal, Willa now owed $480 to Conrad Calhoun, and the term of repayment had passed as of the previous month. There was a grace period, Finch said, still gentle, still precise. 30 days. She could pay the total amount in that time and retain the land. Or the land would be sold at public auction to satisfy the debt. Willa did not have $480. She did not have half that. She had the cattle, and she had the land, and she had a house full of her father's belongings, and the ghost of everything she had grown up believing was permanent. She spent the first week after Finch's visit trying to find a way. She rode to town and spoke to the banker at Harlan Creek's own small bank, a man named Horace Delk, who was sympathetic and regretful, and unable to offer her a loan of that size against land she did not currently hold clear title to. She wrote a letter to her father's brother in Kansas, who she had not spoken to in 8 years, and received no reply in time. She sold 6 head of cattle at a price that barely dented the problem. She was running out of road. It was during this period that Leland Kade first came to her attention in a way that was impossible to ignore. Kade ran the Stillwater Ranch, which was the largest single cattle operation in the county. It was not the oldest money in the region, but it was the most substantial current presence, and Kade himself was a figure that people in Harlan Creek discussed with a mixture of respect and wariness. He was 32 years old, had arrived in the county 6 years prior with enough capital to buy the Stillwater parcel outright, and had built it since then through what appeared to be a combination of genuine ranching skill, a tolerance for hard work that bordered on compulsion, and a reputation for making fair deals that was offset by a reputation for making those deals in a manner that suggested he was not particularly interested in softening the experience for anyone. He was not warm. He was not what anyone would call social. He attended the necessary functions of community life, the cattle auctions, the occasional town meeting, the church on Christmas if the weather was not too difficult, and he did all of these things with an expression that suggested he would rather be somewhere else, and was only present out of a sense of obligation he refused to abandon. He had no wife. He had, as far as anyone knew, no family within several hundred miles. He employed a small crew of reliable hands and paid them well and expected a great deal from them, and they stayed, which said something. Willa had had no personal dealings with him before her father's death. He existed in her peripheral awareness the way that powerful figures in a small community always do, as a known quantity that does not require close examination. She had seen him at the stockyard. She had seen him at the general store. She had formed no opinion of him that was specific enough to be interesting. That changed on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week after Finch's visit, when she arrived at the Harlan Creek land office to speak to the county clerk, a bespectacled man named Gerald Fry, about the formal terms of the auction process, and whether there was any procedural mechanism she might have overlooked that could help her situation. There was not, Fry told her. But he also told her something else, and he told her with the slightly uncomfortable energy of a man who was sharing information he felt she deserved to have, but that was not strictly his business to offer. Conrad Calhoun had already made inquiries about purchasing the Kestner parcel at the auction. He had expressed a strong interest. And given the size of the debt, and the starting bid requirements, the likelihood of a competing bidder driving the price to a level that would allow Willa any portion of the proceeds after the debt was satisfied was not high. Calhoun wanted her land because it sat between two of his existing holdings and would complete a river corridor he had been trying to consolidate for 3 years. She was not a person to him. She was an obstacle that had been conveniently removed by circumstance. She walked out of the land office into the flat morning heat and stood on the boardwalk for a moment with her hands clasped in front of her, and her composure held together through sheer stubbornness. And that was when she nearly collided with Leland Kade. He stepped out of the adjacent doorway at precisely the wrong moment, and she had to stop hard to avoid walking into him. And for a second, they were closer than two people who did not know each other well should be. Close enough that she could see the individual grain of the leather on his jacket and the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. "Miss Kestner," he said. She took a step back. "Mr. Kade." There was a pause. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, something attentive and slightly careful, like a man who had already done the math on a situation and was deciding how much of it to share. "I heard about your father," he said. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," she said, which was the automatic response and meant nothing. He nodded once. He looked like he was going to say something else and then decided against it. He touched the brim of his hat and stepped around her and walked off down the boardwalk, and Willa watched him go with the unshakable feeling that something had just been withheld from her. She did not see him again for 12 days. During those 12 days, she exhausted every remaining option she could think of. She went to the Methodist minister, who was kind and helpless. She spoke to 3 neighboring ranchers who were sympathetic and financially stretched themselves. She wrote another letter to her uncle in Kansas, and this one did get a response, a short and regretful note explaining that he was himself carrying debt from a bad year and could not help. The night she received that letter, she sat on the porch of her father's house in the cooling dark and looked out at the land she had known her entire life, and allowed herself, for the first and only time, to acknowledge that she was probably going to lose it. The creek ran somewhere below the ridge to the east, and she could hear the cattle moving in the near pasture, and the stars above the Texas hill country were the same stars they had always been, indifferent and brilliant and countless, and she felt the full weight of her aloneness like a stone pressed against her chest. She was not a woman who gave up, but she was also not a woman who refused to look at facts, and the facts were sitting on the table in her father's kitchen with the weight of a verdict. The auction was in 9 days. On the 7th day before the auction, a rider came to her property. He was one of Kade's hands, a young man named Porter she recognized from the stockyard, and he handed her a sealed letter without any explanation, and rode back the way he had come. The letter was from Leland Kade. It was 2 sentences long. It said, "I would like to speak to you about the Calhoun matter if you are willing. I will come to your place tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock if that is acceptable, or I will wait for your reply if it is not." She stared at those 2 sentences for a long time. Then she sent Porter back with a single word written on the back of the envelope. Acceptable. He arrived at 8 o'clock the following morning with the exactness she was already beginning to associate with him. She had coffee made, because whatever this meeting was going to be, she was going to conduct it with some degree of dignity. She met him on the porch rather than in the house, because the house was her father's, and she was not ready to share it with a stranger. He looked at the land around her while she poured the coffee, looking at it the way a man who knows land looks at land, taking in the grass quality and the water access and the lay of the pastures. She found this simultaneously irritating and professionally honest. "I'll say what I came to say plainly," he said, when she handed him the cup. "Please," she said. He told her that he had spoken to Horace Delk at the bank, and he had spoken to Gerald Fry at the land office, and he understood the shape of her situation clearly enough. He told her that he was aware that Calhoun intended to acquire her land at the auction, and that he had reasons of his own for not wanting that to happen. She was listening carefully, watching his face. His reasons, he said, were practical. The Kestner parcel's eastern boundary ran along a section of Comanche Creek that fed downstream to the Stillwater Ranch. If Calhoun acquired that land, he would have legal basis to pursue water rights claims that could affect Stillwater's operations significantly. He had consulted with a lawyer in San Antonio about this. The risk was real. "So you want to buy my land instead?" she said flatly. He looked at her. "No," he said. "I want to prevent Calhoun from buying your land." She waited. "I have the capital to bid at auction," he said. "Enough to outbid Calhoun if necessary. If I purchase the parcel, your debt is cleared from the proceeds. Whatever remains above the debt amount goes to you." She felt the cold calculation of it like water down her back. "And then you own my family's land." "Yes," he said, "for your water rights." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she could not read. "That's the practical reason," he said. She set her coffee cup down with a steadiness she was proud of. "Is there another reason?" He did not answer that. He looked out at the land instead, and the silence stretched between them long enough that she stopped expecting a response. "If you acquire the land," she said, "what happens to the house? To the improvements? To the cattle that aren't covered by the auction requirement?" He said that the cattle were hers regardless. They were not secured against the land and had no bearing on the debt. The house and improvements, legally, would transfer with the land. But he had no use for the house and would sign whatever arrangement she wanted regarding her continued occupation of it. She sat with that. It was not nothing, but it was also everything that was wrong. "I would be a tenant on my own land," she said. "Yes," he said. He did not pretty it up. "And you would hold the deed?" "Yes." She looked at him directly, trying to find something in his face that told her what he was actually thinking beneath the surface of this very practical, very coldly rational offer. He met her gaze without evasion, but without opening any window either. He was a closed door with very good hinges. "I need to think about it," she said. He nodded. He stood up from the porch step, set his own coffee cup on the rail, and retrieved his hat from where he had rested it beside him. "You have 6 days," he said. "I know how many days I have," she said, with more edge than she intended. He paused at the bottom of the porch steps. He had his hat in both hands, turning it once slowly in that way men do when they are managing something they cannot say directly. "I understand what it means to have someone hold something of yours," he said quietly, without looking at her. "I would not hold it badly." He put his hat on and walked to his horse and rode away without looking back. And Willa Kestner stood on her porch with her arms crossed against her chest and felt the complicated, awful machinery of her situation grinding forward without her consent. She thought about it for 3 days. She talked to no one, because there was no one to talk to, and because the decision was fundamentally hers regardless of anyone else's opinion. She walked every boundary of the land, something she had not done in years, following the fence lines out to the creek and back along the western ridge and down through the south pasture, where the grass was thin from the dry summer, but still holding. She walked through the house room by room on the second evening, and stood in her father's study with his books and his maps and his account ledgers, and felt the full terrible intimacy of a life already lived in a place, and the specific grief of possibly losing it. On the 4th day she sent word to Leland Kade. She accepted his offer. She did not see him before the auction. She did not attend the auction because she could not stand to watch it and because practically there was no need for her to be present. She heard about it afterward from Gerald Fry, who told her with a kind of fascinated precision that Calhoun had bid hard and Kade had bid harder, and that the final price had exceeded what anyone had anticipated, and that Calhoun had been visibly displeased in the way that very powerful men who are accustomed to having what they want are displeased, which was to say quietly and dangerously. The debt was cleared. There was $87 left after all fees were settled, and Fry gave her the money in cash that afternoon with the professional neutrality of a man who had processed many difficult transactions in his career. She held the bills in her hands in his office and felt their thinness and thought about all the things they did not represent. Kade came to her house the following afternoon with a copy of the transfer documents and a straightforward legal agreement regarding her continued occupation of the property. The terms were simple to the point of being almost embarrassing in their one-sidedness in her favor. She could remain on the land. She owed him no rent. He wanted no formal arrangement regarding the water rights beyond the implicit understanding that Calhoun would not now be in a position to contest them. He had his lawyer's seal on everything. She signed the agreement at her father's kitchen table with him sitting across from her, and the afternoon light coming through the window, and the strange, surreal quality of the moment pressing against her from every angle. "What do you want from me?" she said, before she could stop herself. She set the pen down and looked at him. "You spent a significant sum of money. You cleared my father's debt. You're asking for nothing back and offering me the use of my own land in perpetuity. This does not add up to a business arrangement. What are you actually doing?" He looked at her for a long moment. A muscle moved in his jaw. He had that quality she was learning to recognize in him, of holding something down through main force of will. "I told you my reasons," he said. "You told me one reason," she said. "The water rights." He was quiet. "Leland," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt them both register it. "What is this?" He picked up his hat from the table. He stood. And in the instant before he put his features back in order, she saw something there that was unmistakable and that she was absolutely not prepared for. She saw that it mattered to him, that she mattered to him, that this was not a business arrangement at all, and both of them knew it. "You should stay on your land," he said. "It suits you." He left. She stood at the window watching his horse disappear up the road toward Stillwater and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something warm and frightening and deeply inconvenient. The weeks that followed were strange. She was on her land. She had her cattle. She had her father's house and the creek and the ridge and the stubborn, beautiful, ordinary facts of the life she had grown up in. She also had Leland Kade's name on the deed in the county records office, which was a fact she could not stop turning over like a stone in her palm, looking for the sharp edge she was sure was there somewhere. He did not press her. He did not come around uninvited. He did not try to exercise any authority over the land or interfere with her operations in any way. He was, as he had said, not a bad holder of what was hers, but she could not be comfortable. It was not in her nature to owe something she could not account for, and his reason remained partially unstated, and she was too honest with herself to pretend she did not know what that unstated reason probably was, or to pretend that the knowledge did not create a current running underneath her ordinary days that disturbed everything she tried to settle. In November, 6 weeks after the auction, she ran into him at the general store in town. This was not remarkable. They were in the same county and used the same establishments. But the way he looked up from the counter when she came through the door, the quick arrest of his attention before he schooled his expression back to neutral, that was remarkable. Or it was to her. She bought her supplies. He bought his. They exchanged the courtesies of two people who know each other slightly in a small community, and she was about to leave when he said, without looking at her, while he was counting out coins at the counter, "The south fence along your creek boundary has a section that's pulling loose. I noticed when I was checking the adjoining line. Might want to look at it before the cold comes in." She stopped. She turned slowly. He still was not looking at her. "How long have you been checking the fence on my side?" she asked. A pause. "A few weeks." She did not know what to do with this man. She did not know what to do with the uncomplicated fact that he had been quietly looking out for her property while pretending to have only business reasons for caring about it. She did not know what to do with the way her chest tightened when she looked at him. This large, quiet, impossible man with his cut above the eyebrow, and his closed-door expression, and his inexplicable acts of careful, specific generosity. "Thank you," she said, with more sincerity than she had put into anything in weeks. He finally looked at her, just for a moment, just long enough. "It's your land," he said. "It ought to be properly kept." She went home and fixed the fence herself that afternoon, in the cooling light of the late November day, with her hands in worn leather gloves and her mind running over and over that phrase. "It's your land, not my land. Hers." The winter came in slow and then all at once, the way Texas winters do, and with it came a series of practical problems that occupied most of her attention and most of her energy. Two of her older cows lost calves to the cold. A pipe in the root cellar froze and burst and had to be replaced. The roof above the east room developed a leak that she patched herself with tar and determination, and a considerable amount of profanity into the cold air. She was alone, and the aloneness was harder in winter. She had neighbors she liked, a family called the Pruetts 3 miles east who had a daughter Willa's age, and she visited them sometimes on the long cold evenings. But the fundamental fact of managing the ranch on her own, the physical labor of it, and the financial precision of it, was wearing in a way she had not fully anticipated when she had imagined this future for herself. She had always imagined she would eventually share it with someone. She had imagined it vaguely, the way young women in small towns imagine futures they cannot quite see clearly, knowing the shape of the thing without knowing the face that would fill it. There had been a young man 2 years prior, a school teacher named Davis, who had courted her attentively for several months before accepting a position in Austin and departing without asking her to go with him, which had told her everything about where he had placed her in his own calculations. She had not thought about Davis in a long time. She did not think about him now. She thought about Leland Kade, which was a separate and more complicated problem. She thought about him in the evenings when the house was quiet and the wind came off the ridge. She thought about the things he said, and the things he did not say, and the gap between them which was where he seemed to actually live. She thought about the moment in her father's kitchen when she had seen his careful composure crack for just a second and what had been underneath it. She thought about going to him and asking him directly what this was, this arrangement, this strange dance they were doing around something neither of them had named. She thought about it and then thought about the practical impossibility of it, because she was a woman in 1882 in a small Texas county, and he was the most powerful rancher in that county, and she held nothing legally, nothing at all, and the power imbalance of it was not something she could simply decide to ignore. He had her land. He had not behaved badly with it, but he had it, and until that changed, she could not let herself feel whatever it was she was beginning to feel without also hating herself for the vulnerability of it. On the first Friday of December, Conrad Calhoun came to her house. She opened the door to find him on her porch, and for a moment sheer surprise held her still. Calhoun was in his middle 50s, silver-haired and straight-backed and handsome in the way that money keeps a man handsome, with the kind of composed authority that comes from decades of being the most powerful person in most rooms. He had his hat in his hand, and his expression arranged into something that approximated warmth, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "Miss Kestner," he said, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I wanted to pay my respects regarding your father. Thomas was a good man." "He was," she said, keeping her hand on the door. "He asked if he could come in." She said she preferred to speak on the porch. He accepted this with a slight smile that suggested he had expected it. What he said next, he said in the tone of a man offering a generous solution to a problem that was not his fault, but that he was graciously willing to address. He was aware, he said, of the complicated nature of her current arrangement with Leland Kade. He was also aware that holding a parcel of land in trust for another party was not an entirely stable situation for anyone. He had, he said, a simple offer. He would purchase the Kestner parcel from Kade at a fair price, and he would offer Willa a 10-year lease at a below-market rate, which would give her the security of staying on the land while relieving Kade of an obligation that was not truly in his interest. She listened to all of this. She was very good at listening without her face saying anything. "That's generous of you," she said. "I believe in fair dealing," he said. "I'll pass along your interest to Mr. Kade," she said. "Since the land is his to deal with, as you've noted." Something moved behind his eyes. Just a flicker of it, the calculation beneath the warmth. "Of course," he said. He put his hat back on. "I do hope you'll encourage him to consider it seriously. Arrangements like the one he currently holds can become complicated." "Is that a general observation or a specific warning?" she asked. He smiled. "Miss Kestner," he said, "I am always happy to be as specific as needed." He left, and she stood on her porch watching his buggy disappear down the road, and the chill she felt had nothing to do with the December wind. She saddled her horse that afternoon and rode to Stillwater. She had never been to Kade's ranch before. It was larger than she had imagined, a proper operation with well-maintained outbuildings and a barn that could have held 3 of her own. The main house was solid and unadorned, built for function rather than impression, which somehow seemed completely characteristic. One of his hands, an older man named Soto, met her in the yard and told her Kade was in the barn. He was examining the foreleg of a mare when she walked in, crouched down with his back to the door, and he turned when he heard her step. And for a moment his face did that thing it sometimes did, going open for just a second before composure came back over it. He stood. He looked at her with that concentrated attention of his, taking in the fact that she had ridden over uninvited in the middle of a December afternoon. "Calhoun came to my house today," she said. Something went hard in his expression. "What did he want?" she told him. She told him all of it, including the part about Calhoun suggesting the arrangement between them could become complicated, and watched Kade's jaw tighten incrementally through the telling. "He's trying to use you to get to me," she said. "Or he's trying to use me to pressure you. I can't tell which." "Both," Kade said. "He's been making noise about the water rights through other channels since the auction. He's not done." "What does that mean for the land?" He looked at her steadily. "Nothing. The land is protected as long as I hold the deed." "But for how long can you hold it before he finds another angle?" It was the question she had been avoiding asking, and she could see from the slight pause before he answered that it was a question he had been sitting with too. "I've been in contact with a lawyer in San Antonio about formalization," he said. "There are legal structures that would make the arrangement more stable." "What kind of structures?" He turned back to the mare, ran his hand along her leg with the absent attention of a man who needed something to do with his hands. Marriage, he said very quietly, is the most stable one. But that's not a suggestion. I'm not suggesting that. She stared at the back of his head. There are property arrangements, he continued in a slightly faster voice, that don't require anything so drastic. A formal trust, a co-title structure, things that would make it legally harder for Calhoun to contest. Marriage, she said. He turned. He looked at her. She had the distinct impression of a man who would very much like to be somewhere else. I said that's not what I'm suggesting, he said. I heard what you said. She held his gaze. Why isn't it what you're suggesting? The barn was quiet around them. The mare shifted her weight. Outside, the winter light was going thin and gray. Because it would be the wrong reason, he said. And then, as if he had not intended to say anything further but could not stop himself. For you. The silence between them held something large and unwieldy and impossible to look at directly. Leland, she said, and her voice came out lower than she intended, soft in a way she did not plan. What are you actually doing? He put his hat on. He put it on and adjusted the brim, and he was doing it as armor. She could see that, putting himself back together by the physical act of it. Protecting what's yours, he said. Why? He was quiet for so long that she thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, without looking at her, in the roughest, quietest voice she had ever heard from him. Because the first time I saw you, you were coming out of your father's funeral, and you were completely alone, and you were holding yourself together so hard I could see you doing it from across the street, and I thought that a woman like you should not have to hold herself together alone. And I know that is not a rational thing to say, and I know it is not my business, and I know you have every reason to want nothing to do with me beyond this arrangement. He stopped. He was gripping the brim of his hat in both hands. But you asked me, so there it is. Willa Kestner stood in Leland Kade's barn in the failing December light and felt something in her chest dissolve like ice in warm water. Years of careful self-sufficiency and deliberate independence, and the specific armor of a woman who had learned early that grief came for the things you loved, all of it going soft and uncertain in the face of what he had just said. She had not let anyone see her grief. Not once. She had held herself together across the street from her father's funeral because that was what she did. That was what she had always done, and she had genuinely believed that no one had noticed. He had noticed. That was 4 months ago, she said. Yes, he said. You watched me from across the street 4 months ago and decided to rescue my land. No, he finally looked at her. I watched you across the street and started paying attention. The land situation developed after that. Something was happening to her face that she did not have control of. Something warm and frightened and wanting. I don't know what to do with you, she said. You don't have to do anything with me, he said. The arrangement stands regardless. That's not contingent on anything. I know that, she said. That's not what I mean. He looked at her with that careful, concentrated look that she now understood was him paying the very close attention that was apparently his fundamental mode of engagement with things that mattered to him. What do you mean? He asked, very quietly. She crossed the barn toward him, and she stopped when she was close enough that she had to tilt her head to look at him properly. And she saw him go very still in the way of a man who has held himself in tight control for so long that anything that threatens to change that is both terrifying and necessary. I mean, she said, that I think you are the most frustrating, closed-off, impossible man I have ever encountered, and that I have been thinking about you since September, and that I do not want to be grateful to you because gratitude is not the thing I am actually feeling, and I would very much like you to figure out what to do about that. He looked at her for a long moment that seemed to contain several lifetimes. I could start, he said, by asking whether you would like to have dinner with me on Saturday. She looked at him. Yes, she said. "I would like that." The dinner was at the hotel dining room in Harlan Creek, which was the nearest thing the town had to a formal establishment, and it was both the most ordinary and most charged event Willa could remember participating in. They sat across from each other at a table with a white cloth and a lamp between them, and they talked, actually talked, in a way they had not had occasion to before, moving past the formal transactions that had defined their interactions. She found out that he had grown up in Tennessee, the second of 4 children, on a small farm that had never quite been enough for the family it had to support. He had come west at 22 after his father died and left the farm to debts that had to be cleared. And the parallel with her own situation was not lost on either of them when he mentioned it. He had worked cattle drives for several years, learning the business from the ground up in the specific and unforgiving way that actual labor teaches things that cannot be read in books. He had saved carefully and bought land at 30 in Harlan Creek County because the land was good and the water was present, and he believed in the fundamental value of things that could be grown. She told him about her childhood on the ranch, about her mother and the fever summer that had taken her, about her father and the way he had grieved quietly and redirected himself into the land as a substitute for the things he had lost. She told him about the years of learning to run the operation beside him, the things he had taught her about cattle and water, and the patience that good land demanded. She told him about her own ambition for the place, the improvements she had planned, the additional acres she had hoped to acquire on the north side to improve their summer grazing capacity. He listened to all of this with the complete and undivided attention that was, she was realizing, one of the most attractive things about him, the way he listened as if nothing else existed while she was speaking. They stayed at that table for 3 hours. When he walked her to her horse outside, in the cold, clear December night with the stars extravagant overhead, he paused with her at the hitching post and said, with that slightly stiff quality of a man not accustomed to emotional exposure, "I haven't talked that much in years." "I know," she said. "You were struggling with it." A surprised flash of something crossed his face, and then, for the first time in her acquaintance with him, he almost smiled. It was barely there, just the faintest movement at the corner of his mouth, but she saw it, and it did something very specific to her chest. "Good night, Willa," he said. "Good night, Leland," she said. He helped her up into the saddle with a hand that was careful and warm through her coat sleeve, and she rode home under the December stars feeling something she had not felt since before her father got sick, something uncomplicated and alive. She let herself be cautious about it through December and into the new year. She was not a woman given to impulse, and she was aware of the layers of complexity in this situation. The legal tangle, the power differential, the shadow of Calhoun still hanging over everything, and the simpler truth that she and Leland Kade were 2 very private, very guarded people who had, through a combination of circumstance and what seemed like something larger than both of them, begun to reach toward each other across the considerable distance of their separate defenses. They had dinner again the following Saturday, and the one after that. He came to help her repair a section of her barn roof in January, bringing Soto and another hand, and they worked through a gray, cold morning with the ease of people who were comfortable in each other's presence. And afterward, she made coffee and cornbread, and they sat in her kitchen, the 4 of them, and she watched him be easy with his men in a way she had not seen before, quieter than she expected, respectful in a manner that was not performed. She caught herself watching him often. She was not particularly subtle about it, but then neither was he, and the consciousness between them of being watched and of watching back was itself a kind of intimacy, something being said without words in the dialect of 2 careful people learning to be less careful. In February, Calhoun made his next move. It came not directly but through a rumor, the way the worst things in small communities always come, spreading through the network of town talk until it reached her through the pre-wed daughter, Sarah, who brought it over one afternoon with the slightly agonized expression of a friend delivering bad news. The rumor was that Leland Kade had purchased the Kestner land, not out of any protective instinct, but because he intended to expand Stillwater by incorporating the parcel into his own operation, and that Willa's current occupation of the property was a temporary arrangement that would not survive his interest in her waning. The rumor also carried the specific additional detail, attributed to no one and therefore impossible to challenge, that Kade had made a private agreement with Calhoun to sell the land to him within the year, once the legal complications of the original acquisition had settled. Willa listened to all of this with her coffee going cold in front of her and her face very still. "I don't believe it," Sarah said firmly. "I wanted you to know what was being said." "I know," Willa said. "Thank you." After Sarah left, she sat at her father's kitchen table for a long time. She sat with the rumor and tried to locate within herself the place where she had already decided she trusted him. And she found it. But she also found, alongside it, all the very old machinery of the way distrust operates. The voice that said you do not know him well enough. The voice that said power arranges things in power's favor. The voice that said you let him in because you were desperate and alone, and that is not the same as knowing who someone is. She hated that voice. She had been listening to it her whole life, and it had kept her safe, and it had also kept her from things that might have been worth the risk. She rode to Stillwater that same evening. He was at his desk in the main house when Soto brought her in, working through account ledgers with his sleeves rolled up, and his hair disheveled in a way that was somehow both domestic and entirely unlike the controlled public version of him. He stood immediately when she came in. She told him what she had heard. She told him all of it, watching his face. His expression through the telling was something she would think about later, the way it moved through several registers, from immediate attention through something that looked almost like pain, settling finally on a kind of flat, focused anger that was clearly not directed at her. "Calhoun," he said. "That would be my assumption," she said. "Is there anything in it?" "No," he said. "Not one word of it." He said this without heat, without the defensive urgency of a man trying too hard to convince, just with the level certainty of a man stating a fact he knows is true. "I believe you," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite name. "You rode over here in the dark to tell me in person," he said. "I didn't want to let it sit," she said. "If he's going to keep doing this, we need to think about how to stop it." The rumor about the private agreement is the most dangerous part. That could get into the county records conversation in a way that creates legal complications you don't need. He was looking at her with that intent, focused look again. "You're not angry with me," he said, as if he was slightly surprised by this. "I was for about 20 minutes, she said honestly. "And then I thought about who you are and it stopped adding up. The rumor doesn't sound like you. The version of you it describes doesn't sound like you." Something moved through his face that she had no word for. "Willa," he said. "Don't get sentimental about it," she said. "I'm being practical. What do we do about Calhoun?" By the time she left that night, it was well past 9 o'clock, and at the door of the main house he held the lamp high so she could find her way to her horse, and she was on the step below him when she turned back. She stood on the lower step and looked up at him. In the lamplight, his face was softer than it was in daylight, or she was simply seeing it more clearly. The lines of exhaustion at the corners of his eyes, the slight set of his jaw that she now understood was not coldness, but the holding of something steady. She reached up and touched the scar above his left brow, the one she had noticed the first day in the land office, the one she had never asked about. He went very still. "How did you get this?" she asked. "Ranch accident," he said. 3 years ago, a fence post came loose and caught me." She felt the reality of it, a common enough thing in this work, the ways that ordinary labor carved itself into a body over time. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. "No," he said. She lowered her hand. She was still looking at him. "Leland," she said, "what are we doing?" The question was larger than the evening, and he knew it. "I know what I would like to be doing," he said, with the slightly painful precision of a man being very careful with words. "I'm not sure the current circumstances make it appropriate for me to act on that." "Because of the land," she said. "Because of the land," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "Then we need to fix the land situation." She rode home with a plan forming in her mind that was equal parts legal strategy and something considerably less strategic. The plan, when she consulted the San Antonio lawyer herself, which she did by writing a letter the following Monday, involved a formal transfer of title back to her name using a legal structure that would simultaneously protect the water rights Kade had been using as his practical justification. The lawyer wrote back within 10 days confirming that such a structure was achievable. It would require a formal deed transfer, a water rights agreement signed by both parties, and a filing with the county that would create a legal record resistant to Calhoun's interference. She brought this information to Kade on a cold March morning, riding over early enough that she found him still at breakfast. She laid the lawyer's letter on his kitchen table beside his coffee cup and waited while he read it. When he looked up, his expression was complicated. "This would transfer the deed back to you," he said. "Yes," she said. "Which is the correct arrangement. With the water rights agreement in place, your practical interest is protected. You don't need to hold the deed to protect the water." He was quiet. He looked down at the letter again. "If I transfer the deed back," he said, "there's nothing tying me to your land anymore." "There's the water rights agreement," she said. "That's not what I meant," he said. "I know it's not what you meant," she said. He looked at her. "I want my land back," she said. "And I want it to be mine clearly and legally and completely, without any arrangement or agreement or protection scheme holding it in someone else's name. That is what I want regarding the land." She paused. "The other thing is a different conversation." He looked at her with such intensity that she felt it like a physical thing, the concentrated weight of all that careful, restrained attention, everything he had been holding back for months, right there on the surface, right there in his eyes. "What other thing?" he asked, very quietly. She sat down across from him at his kitchen table in the cold March morning and folded her hands in front of her and said, "Leland, you are the most important person in my life, and I have known it for months, and I have been waiting for the land situation to resolve before I said so because I did not want either of us to be confused about the difference between what I feel and what I owe you. They are not the same thing. I feel something that has nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with who you are, and I would like to stop being careful about it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the first pale suggestion of March warmth was coming through the cold. He reached across the table, and he took her hands in both of his, and she felt the calluses and the warmth of them, the hands of a man who had worked hard at everything in his life, and looked up to find him looking at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded for the first time since she had known him, open and certain and lit from somewhere inside with something that made her feel like the cold had stopped. "I want to transfer the deed back to you," he said. "I have wanted to do it for months. I was waiting until there was no way for Calhoun to use the transfer against either of us legally, and I think we are close to that point now, and your lawyer's letter makes it possible. I want to do it properly in the land office with Fry and a witness. I want it on the record that the land is yours, that it was always yours." "Okay," she said. And then, he said with slightly more difficulty, "I would like to ask you something." "Then ask me," she said. "I'd like to ask you to consider," he said carefully, "whether the arrangement with the water rights might be extended over time into an arrangement of a more permanent nature, between us." She looked at him. She squeezed his hand slightly. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. He looked briefly like a man who had not expected to arrive here this quickly by this route, but who was not at all sorry about it. "Eventually," he said, "if you'd have me." "Yes." "Eventually," she said, "or now," he said. "I'm flexible on the timeline." She laughed, and it was the first real laugh she had produced in so long that it surprised her own throat. Warm and genuine and completely uncontrolled. And his face at the sound of it did something she would remember for the rest of her life, opening up as if the sun had come into the room. They went to the land office on a Thursday in the second week of March, 1883. The day was clear and cold, with a wind cutting down from the northwest that smelled like it had been somewhere higher and cleaner before it arrived in Harlan Creek. Gerald Fry was at his desk. Horace Delk from the bank was the witness, brought in for the purpose and wearing his good vest. Kade laid the deed on Fry's desk and asked him to process the transfer. He named Willa Kestner as the receiving party. He was very precise and very calm about all of it, the way he was precise and calm about things that mattered to him most. Then he picked up the deed himself, and he held it for a moment in his hands, and he turned to her and held it out. She looked at the deed, at the black lettering of her family's land description, at the look on his face, which was the look of a man who had held something important with great care for a long time and was now putting it exactly where it belonged. "It was always yours," he said. She took the deed. Her hands were not shaking this time. Gerald Fry, watching from behind his desk, cleared his throat with professional sensitivity and began stamping documents. She held the deed in her hands for a long moment, looking at her father's name and her own name and the description of the 430 acres where she had grown up and buried her parents and learned to work and learned to love the specific ordinary permanence of belonging to a piece of earth. And then she looked at Leland Kade, this impossible, uncommunicative, deeply decent man who had watched her hold herself together from across a street and decided that was worth paying attention to. "Thank you," she said. "It was inadequate and true." "No," he said simply. Delk signed the witness line. Fry filed the transfer. The water rights agreement was notarized the same afternoon at Fry's office with both their signatures, making it as legally bulletproof as anything in Harlan Creek was going to be in 1883. Calhoun was informed of the completed transfer by his own business agent within the week. Whatever he felt about it, he was smart enough to understand that a legal challenge now would be an expensive and likely unsuccessful enterprise, given the water rights structure that Kade's lawyer had confirmed was solid. He did not disappear as a presence in the county, powerful men never do, but he directed his attention elsewhere, and the specific threat to Willa's land receded until it was no longer something she woke thinking about. The spring came in properly after that, warm and green, the best late rains in 4 years rolling across the hill country and filling the creek and greening the pastures. She threw herself into the work with a physical energy that had been partly dammed up all winter, repairing what the cold had damaged, working the cattle, planning the north pasture lease she had wanted to expand for grazing. Leland came on Saturdays, and sometimes on Tuesdays, and once on a Wednesday afternoon just because, which he explained as needing to ask her something about the creek boundary that turned out to not need asking very urgently, and which she found deeply endearing. He was learning to talk more. She was learning to be still more, to not fill silence that did not require filling, to let the ordinary present of being with him be enough. They were each adjusting, and the adjustment was not always smooth, because they were both stubborn people with ingrained habits of self-protection, but the friction was never unkind. It was the friction of two things fitting together, the necessary working in of something that was going to hold. He took her to dinner in San Antonio in April, a full day's journey, which was an event of some significance in their small community's awareness, and which she met with a complete absence of concern for what anyone thought about it. They stayed at separate hotels, which was the correct and expected arrangement, and she wore her mother's blue dress that she had altered twice over the years to fit her own different shape. And when he saw her in the hotel lobby, he did something she had never seen him do before, which was to stop entirely in place with absolutely no expression on his face, like a man who needed a moment. "You look," he said, and then stopped, which was somehow the most complete compliment she had ever received. They had dinner at a proper restaurant with a menu and a wine list and musicians in the corner, and she watched him navigate the social mechanics of it with slightly wooden dedication, and felt a rush of affection so strong it almost embarrassed her. On the walk back to the hotel, in the San Antonio spring night, he stopped under a gas lamp on the corner of two streets whose names she would look up later in her memory and never quite reconstruct, and he took a small box from his coat pocket and held it out to her. "I bought this 3 weeks ago," he said. "I've been carrying it around since then, trying to determine when was the right moment." She took the box. Inside was a simple gold ring with a small dark garnet, nothing ostentatious, nothing that did not belong to the life they actually lived, and it was the most perfectly him thing she had ever seen. "This is the right moment," she said. "Yes," he said. "I believe I've arrived at that conclusion." She looked up at him in the lamplight, and she thought about everything that had brought them here. The debt and the auction and the deed and the cold December night in a barn where he had said the truest thing she had ever heard a man say. And the months of Saturday dinners and fence-line walks and Tuesday afternoons that were gradually, irreversibly, becoming the foundation of something larger than either of them had planned. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger himself, with the focused, careful attention he gave to things that mattered, and it fit perfectly, which surprised her, and which she later found out was the result of him asking Sarah Pruett to determine her ring size through a mechanism involving a sewing circle and a length of thread that she found both ingenious and completely characteristic. They were married in June, in the Methodist Church in Harlan Creek, on a morning when the hill country was at its absolute best, the cedar and live oak smelling green and sharp in the warm air. The church was full, because it was a small town and this was the event of the season, but the fullness felt like genuine goodwill rather than spectacle. The Pruetts were there, and Fry was there, and old Horace Delk was there, and Kade's hands from Stillwater came clean-shaved and in their good shirts, and Soto was Leland's best man, which made her feel something about the kind of man who chose loyalty over status. She wore her mother's blue dress with new alterations. She carried wildflowers from her own land. He stood at the front of the church in a dark coat she had not seen before, and looked at her when she came down the aisle with such complete and unguarded intensity that she heard Sarah Pruett exhale softly beside her. They were married by the Methodist minister in a ceremony that was simple and meant, and when it was done and they were standing together outside in the June light, receiving the congratulations of the town with the formality and slight awkwardness of two people still learning how to be easy in each other's company in public, she leaned close to him and said quietly, for only him, "You can breathe now." and he huffed out a short sound that was almost a laugh, and it went through her like warm water. They took a wedding journey to Austin, 3 days, staying at a hotel near the Capitol building and seeing a play at a real theater and eating at restaurants that had tablecloths on every table. He brought her flowers the second morning, leaving them outside her hotel room door with a note in his tidy, careful handwriting that said simply, "For the woman who makes me talk." She kept that note. When they came home to the hill country, it was to both properties, because that was the practical question they had navigated before the wedding: what to do about Stillwater and the Kestner land now that they were a single household. The answer they had arrived at was both, at least for now, maintaining both operations but consolidating the management, running them as 2 parts of one larger entity, which made good practical sense, and which allowed her to remain on her father's land without giving up the identity she had built there. She was, formally, Willa Kade now by the legal convention of the day, though she kept Kestner as part of her daily identity in the way that mattered to her. The way her name in the community still carried her father's inheritance and her own. He deferred to her completely on all decisions about the Kestner land, without making a show of it, without performing the deference in a way that would draw attention to the deliberateness of it. He simply did not make decisions about her land without consulting her. When she made a decision he thought was wrong, he said so directly and once, and then accepted her judgment, because it was her land and she knew it better than he did, and her track record of understanding it was longer and deeper than his. This was not always easy, because he had opinions and they were often loud ones, even when expressed in his particularly quiet way. There was a disagreement in the first autumn of their marriage about the timing of the fall cattle sale that became their first genuine argument, conducted at the kitchen table of the Kestner house, with considerable mutual stubbornness, and eventually resolved by her being correct, which he acknowledged the following morning with an expression of someone who has digested something that did not go down easily, but who recognizes the value of it. She loved him past the edges of anything she had vocabulary for. She loved the way he was with the land, the native understanding of it he had built through years of direct labor that matched her own in kind if not in origin. She loved the way he was with the cattle, patient and physical, and without sentimentality, which was the correct way. She loved the way he read in the evenings, serious books about practical subjects, geology and water management, and the economics of cattle operations, dog-eared and annotated in his small, tight handwriting. She loved the way he looked at her when she was working and thought she had not noticed him looking, that concentrated, almost bewildered attention of a man who was still slightly surprised by the luck of his own life. She loved the way he told her things slowly, carefully, as if each confidence was something being offered with both hands, knowing how much it cost him and choosing to pay it anyway. She knew now about his father's death, and the Tennessee farm, and the cattle drives, and the years of working towards something that had always felt slightly out of reach until Harlan Creek, until this particular piece of Texas ground. She knew that he had been lonely for a long time in a way he had not allowed himself to name, and that the naming of it had required her. In the fall of 1884, their first child was born in the Kestner house, which was now their house, in the bedroom where Willa herself had been born 28 years prior. He was a healthy boy with Leland's coloring and Willa's stubbornness visible from his first hours of life, and they named him Thomas Leland Kade, Thomas for her father, which made her cry in the way she did not ordinarily allow herself to cry, quietly and without asking for witness. Kade held his son with the particular stillness of a man who has just realized that the world he has built contains something infinitely fragile and precious, and he looked up at her over the baby's head with an expression of such naked vulnerability that she reached up and put her hand on his face and held it there. "Hello, Thomas," he said to his son. His voice cracked on the name. He did not try to hide it. She lay back against the pillows of her father's house, her mother's house, her own house, with the October light coming through the window and the cedar smell of the hill country in the air, and felt the layering of lives in the place around her. All the love that had happened within these walls before hers, and her own love added to it now, accumulating. They sent word to Soto and to the Pruetts, and to Gerald Fry and to Horace Delk, and to every neighbor in the valley. And the town of Harlan Creek received the news with the particular warm proprietary pleasure of a community that had watched two of its difficult, private members find each other, and felt itself implicated in the happy result. Calhoun, by this time, had largely ceased to be a relevant concern. He had expanded his operations in another direction, acquiring land south of the county, and while he remained powerful and remained someone to watch, the specific threat to the Kestner land had receded into history. The water rights agreement stood. The deed was Willa's. The world had, for once, arranged itself correctly. She thought about her father often in that first year of Thomas's life, in the way that parenthood tends to open a retroactive window onto one's own parents. She thought about what he would have made of all of this, of Leland and the auction and the strange, sideways, entirely unconventional path she had taken to the life she now had. She thought he would have liked Leland. He had been a man who respected direct dealing and consistent integrity, and those were not qualities that Leland Kade lacked. She thought he would have been glad that she had kept the land. In the spring, when Thomas was 6 months old, she walked the full boundary of the property for the first time since the winter before her father died, carrying her son in the cloth wrap that Mrs. Pruett had shown her how to construct, and moving through the landscape of her childhood with all its layers of meaning, the creek and the ridge and the south pasture and the live oaks along the eastern fence. Leland walked beside her, moving through the land with the ease of someone who had spent years learning its specific character and vocabulary. They did not talk much. They did not need to. The land spoke in its own way, in the water sound and the bird call and the specific quality of Texas spring light on cedar, and they were both fluent enough in it to listen without interpreting. At the top of the eastern ridge, where the view opened up to show the whole of the property laid out below, the house and the barn and the creek glinting in the morning light, she stopped. Thomas was sleeping against her chest with the effortless trust of a person who has not yet learned that trust is complicated. Leland stood beside her, looking out at the land. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Regret what?" he said. "Any of it, the auction, the money." The water rights argument that turned out to be mostly a pretext. He was quiet for a moment. Below them, the creek caught the light and held it. The water rights argument was not entirely a pretext, he said. It was a real concern. Leland. "No," he said simply. "I never regret it." She leaned into him slightly, adjusting Thomas's weight, and he put his arm around her without fanfare, without any ceremony at all. Just the habitual warmth of a man who had learned to stop pretending that what he wanted and what he had were different things. "I want to add the north pasture lease to the deed," she said. "I've been looking at the Halbert acreage that came available last month. It would give us the summer grazing I've been planning for 3 years. "I know," he said. "I've been looking at it too." "It would make sense financially to pursue it jointly," she said. "It would," he said. "So we should talk to Fry," she said. "We should," he said. She looked out at her land, her father's land, the land that Leland Kade had held with such careful, temporary custody, the land that had always been hers, and felt the future of it spreading forward from this ridge in every direction, full of things that had not happened yet. Thomas stirred against her chest, making the small sounds of a baby beginning to surface from sleep, and Leland's arm tightened around her slightly, and the hill country morning moved on around them, ordinary and completely sufficient. 2 years after that came their second child, a daughter they named Clara Me, after Willa's mother whose name had been Me. And Clara arrived in the same bedroom as Thomas with the same composure of someone who knew where she was supposed to be and wasted no time in getting there. She was dark-haired where Thomas was fair, loud where Thomas was contemplative, and within her first year had become the unambiguous center of gravity in the Kade household by pure force of personality, which gave Willa a specific satisfaction she did not bother to analyze too closely. Thomas, by this time 3 years old and forming opinions about everything with a speed and definiteness that was entirely his mother's, received his sister with a mixture of suspicion and proprietariness that slowly, over the following months, transformed into the complete devotion of a firstborn to a younger sibling who has the good sense to find them interesting. Leland Kade, watching his daughter's first attempts to stand, holding her carefully upright in the kitchen of the house where she had been born, had that expression again, the one that cost him something to show, the open, unguarded one. "She's going to be trouble," he said. "Yes," Willa said with satisfaction. He looked up at her. The same look he had given her since the beginning, concentrated and warm and slightly bewildered by the specific quality of his own luck. "Come here," he said. She came. The Halbert acreage had been acquired the previous year, the north pasture lease converted to a permanent addition, and the combined Kade property now ran to just over 700 acres with water access that was the envy of half the county and the source of no legal challenges from anyone, because the water rights agreement was solid, and everyone who might have tested it knew better. Gerald Fry had retired, and his replacement, a younger man named Abbott, had processed the last several of their transactions with professional efficiency and a slightly awed quality that Willa found amusing. Horace Delk was still at the bank and still wearing his good vest, and had personally congratulated them on each addition to their family with the warm proprietary pride of a man who felt his early sympathy had been properly rewarded by events. Calhoun had left Harlan Creek the previous year, moving his operations entirely to his South County holdings and selling his original property to a ranching family from Oklahoma. He was not mourned. The specific relief of his absence was not something anyone spoke about directly in a small community, but it was present in the texture of daily life in a way that Willa registered with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been in the path of a threat that had been correctly redirected. She thought, sometimes, about the shape of the story that had led here, the debt and the auction and the deed on the table in the land office, the barn in December and the dinner at the hotel and the ring box under the San Antonio gas lamp. The Saturday mornings when she had first started trusting him, the specific accumulation of small evidences that had built, one by one, into the certainty she now lived inside without effort. She thought about the moment in the land office when he had put the deed on the table between them and said those 4 words, "It was always yours." She had understood it then as a statement about the land, and it was that. It was completely and correctly about the land, about the 430 acres of Texas hill country that she had grown up on, and that belonged to her by right of birth and labor and love. But she had come to understand it as something else too, as the distilled expression of who he was, a man who had understood from the beginning that the things worth having were not things to be held for yourself, but things to be returned to where they belonged. He had held her land carefully and returned it cleanly and asked for nothing except what she chose to give. That was the sum of it. That was the man. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat together on the porch of the Kestner house, with the hill country dark spread out around them, and the stars overhead doing what they had always done, burning brilliantly and without concern for the small dramas of human lives below them. They talked about the land and the children and the practical future of the operation, and the things they had read and the news from Austin and San Antonio that came in the papers, and the particular quality of the current season's grass. And sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that two people only achieve after years of learning each other's rhythms, the silence of people who have stopped needing to fill space to feel connected. On one of these evenings in the late spring of 1887, with the air soft and the creek audible in the distance, and the last of the daylight going rose gold over the western ridge, Willa said, "I want to tell you something." Leland looked at her. "I want to tell you that I know what you gave up," she said. "When you transferred the deed, you had used significant capital, you had a legal claim, you had a practical justification that was genuinely real. You could have kept it and it would have been within your rights." He was watching her. "And instead, you handed it back to me in a land office in front of Gerald Fry and Horace Delk, and said it was always mine." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that I have never in my life felt as seen by another person as I felt in that moment. And I want you to know that I love you in a way that I cannot adequately describe using available language, and that I have been trying to find the right words for 4 years, and I am beginning to suspect they do not exist." He was quiet for a moment. "Somewhere in the dark past the ridge the creek ran. I think," he said carefully, "that what you just said is the most words you have ever directed at me at one time." "I know," she said. "I'll try to be worthy of them," he said. "You already are," she said. He reached over and took her hand and held it on the arm of the porch chair, and they sat that way in the hill country dark with the stars coming out one by one above them, looking out at the land that was hers and his, that had been the beginning and the context and the grounding of everything between them. 430 acres of Texas earth that had held them both while they learned what they were to each other. Thomas called from inside the house, a 3-year-old's demanding summons, and Leland squeezed her hand once and stood and went inside, and she listened to his footsteps on the floor, and his voice, lower and softer than anyone outside the house ever heard it, talking to his son in the patient, unhurried way he talked to things he loved. She sat on the porch of her father's house in the spring dark and felt the rightness of her life around her like the land itself, solid and specific and genuinely hers, earned in the specific way that things worth having are earned, not easily and not without cost, but truly. The stars continued their indifferent burning. The creek ran in the dark below the ridge. Somewhere in the pasture, the cattle moved with the easy purposelessness of animals in good grass, content in the particular freedom of having everything they needed. Inside, she could hear Leland reading to Thomas, his voice a steady low current through the house, and Clara stirring in her cradle with the small sounds of a person deciding whether sleep was finished, and the lamp throwing its warm light through the window into the spring night. She pressed her hand flat against the porch railing, feeling the worn wood of it, sun-dried and smooth, the same railing her mother had held and her father had held, and that she had held herself for as long as she could remember. The wood of it held all that holding, invisible and complete. She went inside to her family. The door closed behind her, and the porch was empty, and the stars burned on above the Texas hill country in the spring dark of 1887, above the Kestner land and the creek and the south pasture and the north acres. and the house where a man and a woman and 2 children had arranged themselves into the durable, particular constellation of a life that had found, after considerable difficulty, and more than one moment of potential ruin, its correct and proper shape.